The Cerro Verde copper mine stretched 3 kilometers into the Peruvian Andes, its tunnels carved like arteries through stone that had slept undisturbed for millennia. Miguel Herrera adjusted his hard hat's lamp as he descended into Sector 7, the deepest point they'd reached in their expansion. The elevator's cables groaned under the weight of 6 miners, their faces already grimy with dust despite the early hour. 20 meters deeper than yesterday, announced Carlos, the shift supervisor, his weathered hands steady on the control panel. The ore samples from this depth show the highest copper concentration we've seen in months. Miguel nodded, though unease prickled at his spine. At 43, he'd spent half his life in these tunnels, following his father's footsteps into the bowels of the earth. But something felt different about this depth. The air carried a staleness that had nothing to do with poor ventilation, and the rock formations they'd been blasting through showed strange discolorations he'd never encountered before. "Mama always said the deep earth holds its secrets for good reason," whispered Joaquin, the youngest of their crew at 19. His grandmother had been a curandera in their village, and her old warnings still echoed in his voice despite his modern education. "Save the superstitions for Sunday Mass," Carlos grumbled. But Miguel noticed how he crossed himself when he thought no one was looking. The elevator shuddered to a stop, and they filed out into the narrow tunnel. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows against the walls, where support beams created geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the uncertain light. The drilling equipment waited like sleeping monsters, their metal bodies still warm from yesterday's work. "Raul and Diego, prep the charges for the eastern wall," Carlos ordered. "Miguel, check the ventilation readings. Joaquin and Esteban, clear the debris from yesterday's blast. I want this section ready for extraction by noon." They dispersed with practiced efficiency, but Miguel's discomfort grew as he moved through the tunnel. The air here felt thick, almost viscous, and his breathing apparatus seemed to struggle against some invisible resistance. When he reached the monitoring station, the readings made him frown. Carbon dioxide levels were normal, but there was something else in the atmospheric composition that the instruments couldn't quite identify. "Carlos," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "You need to see this." Before the supervisor could respond, a sound reverberated through the tunnel that made every man freeze. It wasn't the familiar creak of settling rock or the distant rumble of machinery. This sound was organic, wet, like the whisper of wind through a throat lined with moisture. "What the hell was that?" Esteban dropped his shovel, the clatter abnormally loud in the sudden silence. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a series of clicking noises that seemed to emanate from multiple directions at once. Miguel's lamp swept the tunnel walls, searching for the source, when his beam caught something that made his blood crystallize in his veins. The eastern wall, where they'd been preparing to blast, showed a jagged crack that definitely hadn't been there an hour ago. But it wasn't the crack itself that terrified him. It was what lay beyond it. A darkness so complete that his powerful LED couldn't penetrate it. And from that darkness came the sound of movement. Not the scurrying of rats or the flutter of bats, but something larger, coordinated, purposeful. "Everyone back to the elevator," Carlos whispered, his authority cracking like old leather. "Now!" They began to retreat, their footsteps thunderous in the oppressive silence, when the crack in the wall suddenly widened with a sound like breaking bones. Something pale flashed in the darkness beyond, and then the emergency lights began to fail, section by section, as if some unseen force was systematically destroying them. In the growing darkness, their helmet lamps became isolated islands of light, revealing glimpses of horror that their minds struggled to process. The things that emerged from the crack moved with fluid grace, despite their apparent age. Their skin was the color of cave fish, translucent and veined with dark networks that pulsed with their own rhythm. But it was their eyes that truly terrified. Completely white, adapted to absolute darkness, yet somehow tracking the miner's every movement with predatory precision. "Madre de Dios," Joaquin breathed, and Miguel realized the boy was praying in Quechua, the ancient language of their ancestors. As if Spanish wasn't old enough to contain such terror, the creatures moved without sound now, flowing across the tunnel floor like spilled mercury. Miguel counted at least 6, but the dancing shadows made it impossible to be certain. Their faces held a terrible intelligence, and their mouths, when they opened, revealed rows of teeth that had been designed by evolution for one purpose: to puncture and drain. "The elevator!" Carlos screamed, and they ran. But even as they sprinted through the tunnel, Miguel realized with sick certainty that they wouldn't make it. The creatures moved too fast, too silently, and the elevator was still 50 meters away. Behind them, he could hear wet sounds, the whisper of claws against stone, and something that might have been laughter if it had come from human throats. Raúl stumbled, his equipment pack catching on a support beam, and in the second it took him to free himself, one of the creatures was upon him. Miguel turned, his lamp illuminating a scene that would haunt his dreams forever. The thing fastened to Raúl's neck with an intimacy that was obscene, its throat working rhythmically as it fed. Raúl's struggles grew weaker, his cries fading to whispers and then to nothing at all. "Keep running!" Carlos shouted, but Miguel could hear the despair in his voice. They all understood now that they were no longer miners working a shift. They were prey, trapped in a maze of their own making, hunted by things that had mastered these depths long before humans had learned to walk upright. They reached the elevator shaft to find their worst fears confirmed. The cables hung in twisted ruins, severed with surgical precision. Above them, the shaft stretched into darkness, and below, they could hear movement in the tunnels they'd just fled. "The emergency shaft!" Esteban gasped. Section 4 has an old service tunnel that connects to the main levels. It was their only chance. They plunged back into the maze of tunnels, using their intimate knowledge of the mine's layout to navigate toward the forgotten passage. But with each turn, each desperate sprint through the darkness, Miguel became increasingly aware that they were not just running from the creatures, they were being herded. The things that hunted them possessed an intelligence that operated on a level beyond simple predation. They cut off escape routes with coordinated precision, appearing from side tunnels to block paths, forcing the miners deeper into areas where the old maps showed only blank spaces marked with warnings about unstable ground. "There," Diego pointed with a shaking hand toward a narrow opening in the tunnel wall. "The service shaft." The passage was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, its walls rough-hewn and ancient. As they crawled through the claustrophobic space, Miguel's lamp revealed tool marks that predated modern mining equipment. These tunnels had been carved by hand by men who had worked these depths generations ago with nothing but picks and dynamite. But they had also found something else. The walls here were marked with symbols that no mining company had ever carved. Spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the uncertain light, and beneath them, darker stains that Miguel's mind refused to identify. "How long have they been down here?" Joaquin whispered, his voice barely audible above their labored breathing. Miguel had been wondering the same thing. The creatures moved through the tunnels with the familiarity of long-time residents. They knew every passage, every hiding place, every escape route. This wasn't their first hunt in these depths. They emerged from the service tunnel into a wider passage that Miguel didn't recognize from any of the mine's official blueprints. The walls here were different. Too perfectly carved to be natural, yet too ancient to be part of the modern mining operation. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, revealing glimpses of artwork that predated the Spanish conquest. Figures engaged in ceremonies that involved offerings to entities dwelling beneath the earth. "We're in the old workings," Carlos realized, his voice hollow with understanding. "The ones they sealed up in the 1960s after the accidents." Miguel remembered the stories now, half-forgotten tales that the older miners shared during lunch breaks. Men who had disappeared in the deep tunnels, their bodies never found. Work crews who had abandoned entire sections without explanation, claiming the rock itself was cursed. Management had dismissed such stories as superstition, but they had quietly sealed those areas nonetheless. A sound behind them ended their momentary respite. The creatures had found the service tunnel, their bodies moving through the narrow space with impossible flexibility. The miners ran again, deeper into the forgotten sections of the mine, their lamps revealing chambers that had been carved for purposes that had nothing to do with extracting ore. In one vast cavern, their lights illuminated dozens of alcoves carved into the walls, each sized to hold a human body. Many were occupied, containing mummified remains that wore the clothing of miners from different eras. Some wore the canvas and leather of the early 20th century, others the synthetic materials of more recent decades. All showed the same 2 puncture wounds in their throats, perfectly preserved in the dry air of the deep tunnels. "Jesus Cristo," Esteban whispered, backing away from the grisly display. "How many?" "Enough," said a voice from the darkness beyond their lights. But never enough. The creature that emerged from the shadows was different from the others. Larger, older, its pale skin marked with scars that spoke of centuries spent in these tunnels. When it spoke, its voice carried the accent of colonial Spanish, the formal pronunciation of a time when the conquistadors had first brought their greed to these mountains. "You wake us with your noise, your explosions, your endless hunger for the metals that sleep in our domain," it continued, its white eyes fixed on Miguel with terrible intelligence. "We who have dwelt here since before your ancestors learned to fear the dark." "What do you want?" Carlos managed to ask, though his voice cracked with terror. "What we have always wanted. What you have brought us through your trespass. Blood. Life. The sustenance that flows through warm veins to fill our cold bodies with borrowed vitality." Miguel's mind raced. The creature spoke of dwelling here for centuries, but that was impossible. The mine was barely 50 years old. "Unless the original workings," he said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You were here when the Incas mined these mountains. When the Spanish came, you've been feeding on miners for 500 years. The creature's mouth stretched in what might have been a smile. "The deep places of the earth remember all who enter them. We are the guardians of those memories, the collectors of the red life that seeps from the surface world. Your modern machines have simply given us easier access to our food." More creatures emerged from the alcoves, moving with the coordinated purpose of a pack that had hunted together for centuries. Miguel counted at least 20, their pale forms creating a circle of death around the trapped miners. "Run!" he whispered to his companions, and then louder, "Run!" They scattered in different directions, their desperate flight illuminated by muzzle flashes, as Carlos emptied his service pistol into the creatures. The bullets seemed to have little effect beyond enraging them, their ancient bodies too desiccated to be stopped by simple lead. Miguel found himself alone in a narrow tunnel, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he navigated by the fading light of his helmet lamp. Behind him he could hear screams that cut off with terrible suddenness, and he knew that his friends were dying one by one. But he also knew these tunnels. 30 years of working in the mine had given him an intimate knowledge of its layout, including sections that weren't on any official map. If he could reach the old air shaft in Section 2, he might be able to climb to safety. It was a desperate chance, but it was the only one he had. The tunnel branched ahead, and Miguel chose the path that led toward the older sections of the mine. His lamp was beginning to dim, its battery drained by hours of desperate flight, but he pressed on through the increasing darkness. The creature's hunt continued behind him, their movements creating subtle sounds that echoed through the stone passages, the whisper of claws, the soft pad of feet, and sometimes, terrifyingly, the sound of laughter. The air shaft, when he finally reached it, was exactly as he remembered, a narrow, vertical tunnel that rose through the mountain's heart toward the surface. The ladder rungs were corroded with age, but they still seemed solid enough to support his weight. As he began to climb, his failing lamp revealed something that made him pause, fresh scratches in the metal, as if something else had used this route recently. He climbed faster, his muscles screaming with exhaustion, driven by the certainty that the creatures were following. Above him, he could see a faint glimmer that might have been daylight, impossibly distant but real. The surface world, where the sun still shone and normal rules applied. Halfway up the shaft, his lamp finally died, plunging him into absolute darkness. He climbed by feel alone, his hands finding each rung through memory and desperation. The scratches in the metal grew more pronounced, and he realized that the creatures had indeed used this route before. How many miners had attempted this same escape, only to find death waiting for them in the darkness above? A sound below him made him freeze. The whisper of movement in the shaft. They were coming, climbing with the fluid grace of spiders, their claws finding purchase on the stone walls where human hands would slip. Miguel climbed faster, his breath coming in panicked gasps, his hands bleeding from their desperate grip on the corroded metal. The light above grew brighter, and he could feel the touch of moving air on his face. The surface was close, so close, but the sounds of pursuit grew closer as well. Claws scraped against stone just below him, and he could hear breathing that wasn't quite human. He reached the top of the shaft to find himself in a storage building that hadn't been used in years. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, and the sight of it nearly brought him to his knees with relief. But even as he stumbled toward the door, he heard movement in the shaft behind him. The mine's surface complex was deserted, the day shift not due to arrive for several hours. Miguel ran toward the administrative building, where he could call for help, raise the alarm, warn others about what lurked in the depths below. But with each step, he became increasingly aware of a terrible truth. Who would believe him? How could he explain what had happened without sounding like a man driven mad by darkness and fear? He reached the radio room and began broadcasting a Mayday call, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and terror. "This is Miguel Herrera from Sector 7. We have an emergency in the deep tunnels. Do not send anyone down. Repeat, do not send anyone into the lower levels." The response crackled back immediately. "Miguel, this is Control. What's your status? We show a group alarm from your sector." "They're all dead," Miguel said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Carlos, Joaquin, all of them. There are things in the deep tunnels. Old things. They've been there for centuries." Silence from the radio then. "Miguel, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" He understood their disbelief. In their world of schedules and safety protocols, there was no room for the kind of horror he had witnessed. They would send rescue teams, investigators, men with equipment and confidence who would descend into the darkness thinking they faced a cave-in or a gas leak. "Listen to me," he said desperately. "Seal the mine. All of it. Don't let anyone go down there. There are creatures in the old workings, things that feed on blood. They killed my entire crew. Miguel, we're sending a team to your location. Stay where you are, and don't touch anything." He knew they would never believe him until they saw the evidence for themselves. And by then, it would be too late. The creatures had tasted fresh blood after who knew how long, and their hunger would be awakened. They would spread through the tunnels, following the scent of life toward the surface. Miguel left the radio room and walked to the edge of the mining complex, where the mountain rose in stark majesty against the morning sky. Somewhere far below, in darkness so complete that it had never known the touch of sun, ancient hunters were stirring. They had been patient for decades, feeding on the occasional miner who ventured too deep, but now they had been fully awakened. The morning shift would arrive in 3 hours. Young men like Joaquin, fathers like himself, all unaware of what waited for them in the depths. And after them would come the rescue teams, the investigators, the experts, who would dismiss local superstitions until they found themselves face to face with the truth. Miguel thought of his wife, waiting at home with breakfast on the table, and his 2 sons who had recently expressed interest in following their father into the mines. He thought of his father who had worked these same tunnels and spoken sometimes of sounds in the deep places that didn't belong to any earthly thing. The old miners had known. They had always known. The mountain held secrets that were older than human civilization, and some doors should never be opened. But human greed was as persistent as water, always finding a way to flow into new spaces, always pushing deeper into places that should have remained undisturbed. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the mining complex, Miguel began to walk toward the road that led down to the village. Behind him, he left the radio chattering with increasingly urgent calls for him to respond. Ahead of him lay the difficult task of convincing people that the modern world's hunger for copper and gold had awakened something that viewed human beings as nothing more than a convenient food source. The mountain watched him go with ancient patience, its peaks catching the morning light while its depths harbored darkness that no lamp could penetrate. In the tunnels far below, pale figures moved through chambers carved by human hands but claimed by inhuman hunger. They had waited so long, sustained by the occasional offering that the mine provided, but now their patience was at an end. The veins of the earth ran deep, carrying not just precious metals but also the lifeblood of those who dared to disturb the sleeping places of the world. And in the depths where no sun had ever shone, the harvest was about to begin. 3 hours later, the morning shift arrived to find the surface complex abandoned, except for a radio that continued to broadcast an endless loop of warnings that no one wanted to believe. By evening, when the first rescue team descended into Sector 7, the creatures had already begun to spread through the mine's arterial network, following the scent of warm blood toward the surface. The mountain kept its secrets for 500 years, but human persistence had finally broken the ancient seals. Now, as the sun set behind the Andean peaks, the true owners of the deep places prepared to reclaim what had always been theirs, the right to feed on those who trespassed in their domain. In the village below, Miguel sat with his family, trying to find words to explain why they needed to leave immediately, why the mine that had sustained their community for generations had become a source of death. Outside their window, the mountain rose against the darkening sky, beautiful and terrible, its slopes scarred by human ambition but its heart still beating with the rhythm of something far older than mankind's hunger for the riches buried in stone. The veins of the earth ran deep, and tonight they would run red.